All right, so let's kick this guy off. I want to welcome everyone again. Thank you for attending today. I know everyone's really busy. We're going to look at creating web APIs with App Builder, Entity Framework, Power Tools, and SQL Server. Most of the session is similar to what we did a couple weeks ago. I'm going to introduce a new tool. So I'm not going to rehash everything we did last time. A bunch of code's already up on GitHub. The new tool today is Entity Framework Core Power Tools, which I think are really slick, and they add a little bit more juice to what we had last time. And like I said, I won't do the product justice, but I will do my best on what I know. And that's what's important. We're all learning here. But I think you'll see immediate time savings in a tool like the Entity Framework Core Power Tools. So today's host, again, is my name's Jason. Brian is with us as usual. He's my live debugger. So if I run into errors, don't worry. He's like in IntelliShare in Visual Studio, so he'll fix them right away as I ask for help. But it should be pretty smooth sailing today. So what we're going to do is look at what is EF Power Tools, EF Core Power Tools. We're going to create a web API. We're going to consume that in Angular. And that's the part where, depending on the time, we'll kind of breeze right over. I've got the running app that we did last 2 weeks ago, but although using a different table. So everything's up on GitHub. And so it's private now. I'll make it public during the webinar right after so everyone can access it. And you can just download the code because honestly, that's how we all learn. Housekeeping, ask questions in the Q&A or chat window. If you do a chat, make sure that you do to everyone. And that way everyone will get your question and everyone will get your answer. And then if you do Q&A, we'll probably live review this. So we got about 30 minutes. So let's kick this off. Today is EF Core Power Tools. In 2 weeks, we are releasing 22.2. Actually, we're releasing 22.2. Officially, the marketing date is November 3rd, I think. But we're doing the What's New webinar on October 27th. And for the most part, all of the bits will be ready. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, we did charting, I believe. Yeah, we did a lot on charts. All that stuff will be available to you the last week of October. App Builder, we're actually doing a release this week with a bunch of new stuff, which you're going to love. And so 22.2 is sort of this culmination building up to everything grouped together. The big feature in 22.2 in App Builder are the new grids, and then outside of App Builder for Blazor specifically. So we've got a new flat grid, new tree grid. Hopefully we'll be shipping the new hierarchical grid. If not, it'll come shortly after that, new pivot grid, all Blazor. And we know everyone loves Blazor. And we're also doing the same in web components. Web components means you don't need a framework. So if you're a framework agnostic and you're a purist and you want web components, great. Ignite UI Web Components is your product. And by the end of October, you're going to have 4 of the most amazing grids that you've ever seen in your life for web components. So we're really excited about this 22.2 release. It's huge. November 8th, we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm probably not going to focus as much on App Builder. I'm going to show how to deploy everything. So for example, everything we're doing today, I'm running locally for the most part. I'm using an Azure SQL database, but my application, my web API is local and these other things. We're going to learn how to deploy that to Azure and then how to secure all of your credentials using Azure Key Vault so that no one can steal your username and password. And so that's a very specific thing you need to learn in order to have functional Azure apps, Azure function apps, whatever you're using databases in the cloud. November 29th, we're going to have a really cool webinar. Brian and I were talking about it before this thing started, where we're going to do Blazor Crud, but it's going to be more advanced. So we're going to do like templates, like combo box templates inside of grids, pop-up forms, multi-table updates. So it's going to be more of like a realistic type app. A lot of the stuff I've been showing lately is relatively simplistic. You got primary foreign keys, you got some other things, but you know, it is what it is. And then the end of the year, we'll do an App Builder roundup. So a lot of good stuff coming, and make sure that you sign up for those webinars. Very similar metrics to what we saw in the last webinar. The reason we built App Builder and the reason we're doing these webinars is because you spend most of your time doing the things that we can automate. So our surveys show us, and you're going to do a survey today, if you have time during the webinar, show us that developers spend more than 1/3 of their time working with HTML, CSS. 44% of developers note this is the task that slows them down the most. So if we can start eliminating all this hard stuff with HTML, CSS, screen layout, binding data, and just do it in App Builder, then you can focus on all these other things like doing your web API code or doing your domain specific logic code and all these other things. So, it's everything's about productivity. Today's about productivity. EF core power tools are about productivity. So how can you cut down on things that you spend time on that you shouldn't really be spending time on? And then, of course, we all know designers are a luxury. Only 26% of developers work with the design team. Nearly 3 out of 4 developers are left to act as UI designers, which is part of the problem. So with App Builder, we automate all this for you. So that's what you'll see a little bit of today. We won't spend a ton of time on that, but let's take a quick look at EF Core Power Tools, and this will give you sort of a background on what we're doing. If you were at the webinar about a month ago, we used some of the command line tools to do a migration. So we did like a database migration with the Microsoft Entity Framework stuff, and those migrations generated some code. And then we used that code to create an application. And we're going to do the same thing today. We're just going to use a different tool. And the reason I like this tool is because it doesn't really make me learn anything. I just kind of hit a button and it goes, but it's the same stuff that you would get from, or it's actually not the same stuff. It's actually a little bit better than what you would get from using the Microsoft tools that you would install via NuGet and use the command line to do. So it's a little bit different. But the whole goal of tools like this is to automate tedious CRUD data code in migrations by reverse engineering your database or by doing code first migrations. You can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do today a reverse engineer. What you can do is you can reverse engineer SQL database, SQL Server, SQLite, Postgres, MySQL, Firebird, Oracle, SQL Server database projects, and DACPack files. And the nice thing is you get a nice little user interface to do this. So when Eric, who I mentioned on the, when I saw him roll in today into the webinar chat, Eric is the creator of this tool. So we actually have the genius who did all this work with us today, which is very exciting. So if you have any questions, they will absolutely be able to be answered by Eric. And lo and behold, here's Eric. I just happened to have the YouTube page up that I wanted to show everyone. So let me show you first where to find today's tools. So what you're going to do is, and actually I thought I had the right page up. This is the GitHub page. But let's see, you get this from the Visual Studio Marketplace. So the best place to go is to Google or Bing and type in EF Core Power Tools, Eric, Visual Studio Marketplace, and you will come to this page as the first result. From here, you download the power tool and double click it or automatically install it right from Visual Studio. And then you'll have the power tools installed. I'm going to show you what that looks like, but essentially, you're going to get a user interface that allows you to connect to your database and then select some options on what you want to do. To learn about this, there's a GitHub page, there's a wiki page, there's a YouTube video, there's all kinds of stuff. So if you click on more information on the wiki page here, you end up at Eric's GitHub page, and then you can kind of get some more information here. What I ended up doing, and I did this too late, I should have done it a lot earlier in my journey, is I clicked the reverse engineering quick start. I actually didn't watch the video. I went to the wiki, and then in the wiki, there's all this stuff here that will tell you how to use all of the different capabilities of the product and then kind of get what you need. What I'm going to show you today is a quick reverse engineer, and then we're going to consume that in a web API. And then we're going to use one that I already have completed, and we're going to just use an Angular application to show you how everything kind of ties together. So use the GitHub page, go here to download everything. And then Eric, feel free to add comments to everyone in the chat as I'm going along. You should probably watch this video. Like I said, I should have too, but this is Eric and he's on board today with us. So I'm pretty excited. The Angular app that we're going to build is this guy right here. This is a very simple Angular application built in App Builder. It's bound to our web API. And so it'll be able to do things like when I click add row, I can type in a task name We've got some nice column types here, so I can select some date fields. I'm going to give it a project, type in some junk, give it a project, and then click done. And then what that'll do is it'll update the database over in Azure, and then it kind of shows what's going on here. So we're actually going to do, I'll show you how this all ties together. If I do a refresh, you'll see that there's our data, and then we're going to call this task name nice, and let's change the due date to another due date. We'll go ahead and make it January. Assigned to is going to be Zdravko, and priority 2, we'll click done. And then you can see that this updated, and I'll hit a refresh and you can see that it updated. So we're going to see how all this ties together. But first, let me go ahead and minimize this, and I'm back at my screen here. What I'm going to do is fire up a new version of Visual Studio. And there's one thing I need to do, but we'll do this in a second. So I'm going to create a new project, and I want to create an ASP.NET Core Web API. And we can call this test demo, like so. Click next. And we're going to uncheck to use the minimal APIs, which doesn't really matter if you do that, but that's okay. We'll click create, and we're ready to go. So now what I want to do is I want to use the EF Core Power Tool. So I already went ahead and installed the EF Core Power Tools. They're already ready to go. I'm going to right click on my project. And once you install them, you'll see this menu option. So from the EF Core Power Tools menu option, you can do reverse engineer, migrations, add DB context, T4 scaffolding, like all the stuff that you might want to do with the command line tools with Entity Framework, but they're kind of spread out all over the place. So here, everything's kind of in one spot. So I'm going to select reverse engineer. And you'll see here it says JBarris Project Tracker. Well, I already have my database connection string already in there. If you don't, you could click Add Database Connection, and then you could go ahead and add your database connection that way. And if I click that, this dialog comes up sort of like you would expect. I have a few server names here, localhost and my SQL Express and all this other stuff. I'm not going to wait for all that to happen, but I'm using Azure today. So here, if I bring up, I think I've got this open, right? So here's my Azure database, and up in Azure, I've got a projects table and I've got a tasks table. So if I select the top 1,000 rows of projects, it's a very simple table. I've got, click run. I've got these guys here, and then tasks. We just added one task, so we should see this task, right? So let's go ahead and run this guy, click run. Now I just started using this Azure SQL Query Editor. It's in preview. I also do the same thing here with SQL Server. So I connect in to the same server with the same tables, and you can do the same thing here. It's about, maybe a little bit more performant when you do it with SQL Server Management Studio. But, it's up to you what you want to use. If you just want to go through the cloud, you can do everything in the cloud. But you'll notice here that I've got a bunch of different things here. So, for example, I've got a view. I've got something called VW Tasks Projects, which is going to kind of do a join on my teams. I've got something here called Delete Project. So if I click the little overflow and I view the definition, I have some stored procedures that are doing deletes, inserts, updates, selects, etc. I want to use all those in my project. So I'm going to just click OK here. And it's going to bring me to the Choose Database Objects field. You'll see everything here is exactly what I had in my other in SQL Server. So all of my stored procedures, my view with all its fields, etc. So I'm just going to do a select all on all this stuff like so. And I'm going to click OK. Now, this is where you get to customize some of your options. I use this straight out of the gate, so it's super simple. All I do is to organize what gets generated is I put all the entity types in a folder called models, and I put all of the DB context stuff in a folder called data. If you want to pluralize or singularize your generated name objects, If you want to use table and column names directly from the database, you want to use data annotations, you want to customize templates, all these things like you can do on your own. Install EF Core Provider package in the product. So that'll install my packages, I believe. I don't know if I've actually tried that yet, but I'm going to leave it checked. And then there's some advanced options here around how the code generation is done, how the file layout is done, etc. There's some experimental features here. And then the other thing I thought was interesting is that you can use customized code templates with T4 templates. So I'm assuming there, if you have your own T4 templates, you could use those, or you could customize what actually gets generated. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And this will create my data folder and my models folder. Look what this did. It created all of my DB context. And now remember, and I'm going to move this over a little bit. Remember, the DB context is really how we connect to the database. So I've got this DB context option, and then the DB context option is what is going to allow me to get my tables back. So I've got projects, tasks, and view projects. Now what's new here is we've got project tracker context procedures. This is my stored procedures. So these are all my stored procedures. This is something you don't get from any of the entity framework tools. So that's where this is unique. If you want to use stored procedures, all of this code gets generated for you. You don't have to do anything special. Now, it looks like I've got some things here in terms of entity framework and all this other stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll go to my dependencies, packages. I've got Swashbuckle installed. So I need to go and right click, and we will manage NuGet packages. Let's go to browse. Let's type in entity framework like so. And I'm going to install here the entity framework SQL Server tools, and I need to install the entity framework core tools. These NuGet packages are just dependencies to use entity framework. And then our project will build, and you can see entity framework core does not exist. So let's do core here. And there's entity framework core. We can install, and we'll say okay, and we should be good to go. All right, so now you'll notice no more errors. We are good. All of our entity framework stuff is in here and ready to rock and roll. Now I'm going to slide this over just a little bit, and I'm going to scroll down because I want to show you something here that maybe I did or did not do. Is this project tracker context? So I'm going to go back and go to EF Core Power Tools. I'm going to say okay here. And what I want to highlight is an option here that says, let's see, include connection string and generated code. I did not have that checked. If you do check this box, I'm going to click OK. When you do the migrations with SQL Server, you get the use SQL Server option. And this is what I'm talking about, the Microsoft command line tools. You do get your connection string. If you have this, then it's really easy to kind of do basic things like I'm showing. But what you really want to do is put your connection string in your user secrets. That way, nothing gets deployed out to, GitHub or Azure or wherever else. It's secret. So then you use something like Key Vault or any other tool to do that. So I'm going to close this so then no one sees my username and password, because that was a mistake I made last time that Brian kind of highlighted for me. And we'll just go ahead and click run. And all this is going to do is bring up our default Open API template because we have Swashbuckle installed. And you can see that we've just got the weather forecast API because we haven't done anything yet. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use some of the neat things that we get here with EF Core Power Tools. The first thing I'm going to do is delete this garbage here. We don't need this weather forecast. And very easily, we can just start using our fields or our tables, from the database. So what I'm going to do is just copy a few lines of code or just copy things over so I don't have to type. But what I'm pasting here is directly from the help that I just showed you in the wiki. So that SQL Server reverse engineer wiki, I just copy and pasted some things here, and then I kind of built on my own. But what we're doing here is we're creating a new DB context. So when we create this new DB context, that means it creates an instance of this object, And then because I have the connection string in here, I'm able to then start using the objects that we have in here. So now that I say using that, I'm going to say var, and I'll get tasks and projects, because actually we did add a task before. This would have been nothing. And we're going to do an await. And the way that you work with stored procedures or views is you just reference the object directly. So in this case, I'm going to say db dot, and db dot is going to start giving me all the things I have available to me, like VW tasks and projects, or db dot just projects. So these are objects that are coming across Entity Framework. So if I do db.vw tasks and projects, that will return to me my tasks and projects. And let's see, what did I do wrong here? equals, I did something wrong. Let's do a console.writeLine, and I'll say, I am here. And this is just going to be where I'd set a breakpoint all the time, because what we want to do is just kind of see what we can do. So we'll do viewing the tasks and projects, and then let's do something a little more sophisticated. I'm going to use a query. We'll do a link query here. So let me paste this guy in. So this is project, and I'm going to do not just all the projects, I'm going to do where project ID equals 1. So just return to me those two options. So we'll run this guy now, and we'll look at what the debugger is going to show us. And again, the beauty of this is that you didn't have to write any code to make this happen. So I said, give me where the project is 1. I've got project A, and my project ID is 1. So that's actually my project 1. Tasks and projects here, I get a result back. And if I drill into this, I've got project A, task name nice. That was the task that I literally just entered in before in the Angular app. And Dravco, you can remember that was the assigned, and these were the dates that I put in. So with just a few lines of code, I'm already connected to my database, doing the project tracker context, and I'm actually getting data out. So how do you do stored procedures? Stored procedures are very similar. So here, if I say var projects tasks, since we already know that guy works, I'm going to say equals await, and this guy's going to be DB again, but this is a little bit different. In order to use stored procedures, you say get procedures, and then in your IntelliSense, you're going to start getting all of these stored procedures that are available to you. So here I prefixed everything with SP, so they're super easy to find. And in this case, we will do SP, we'll do select project async. So let's do SP underscore select project async, and that'll do it for that. And then we'll be able to see that we get some information back here. I thought we did select projects async. There we go, like so. And that's going to execute the stored procedure. And this is the big difference. And this is why I would recommend using Entity Framework Core Power Tools. I'm sure Eric can give you a lot of different other benefits than just using the Entity Framework tools, is that you have all the code is generated for stored procedures. Now, if you're a hardcore dude and you want to write all this code yourself, that's fine. If you go, for example, to SP insert task result, essentially it's creating the class. So all of this gets auto-generated. And then when I look at the stored procedure context, it creates the entity for you. And what it's doing underneath is it's just using execute raw SQL async, which is what you would be doing anyway. So I always like when people poo-poo on these tools that are really useful, I always ask them, why do they want to write this code themselves, right? Because if you're going to write the same code, then just use a tool to do it. It just automates it. Now, here's the other neat thing. And we'll look at this in my app in a second, but we're automatically, because my stored procedure has an output parameter, I think it has an error parameter. And on some of them, I'm actually doing a select based on the identity column that I just inserted. All that gets generated for me. So I don't have to really worry about that. So in this case, I will leave this where we're at. Maybe I'll just do a couple here. Let's do an insert. So I'll copy this guy and let's insert a new project, and we'll call this one Z. And in this case, I will delete a project. So you can see that doing stored procedures or anything is going to be very similar. And I'll delete project 8. And let's go ahead and run this again. And there we go. We're stopped. So if I go back to SQL Server and I look at my projects table and I select the top 1,000 rows, we can see that project Z was inserted and project 8 is gone. I actually deleted 7 and 8 earlier in my testing. All right, so how would you use this in your application? So what I have here is a project that will look vaguely familiar to what we did a couple weeks ago when we created our first web API. So I did the same thing here. I ran the entity framework power tools. I selected all my stored procedures and I selected all of my views and all that good stuff. The only difference here, and I'm just going to move this way over so you don't see my username and password, is if I go to manage user secrets, I'm using a SQL connection here instead of straight up saying use DB context, which would have meant I have my connection string inside of my DB context. Of course, I've deployed, or I didn't deploy this yet to Azure, but I will. And so I don't want my freaking username and password being flown all over the place from GitHub and all this other stuff. So the only difference between saying var db equals new project tracker context is you create a connection string, you use builder.services to tell it to use the connection string with the SQL Server provider, and then to enable the stored procedures so you don't have to use get procedures. There's an interface and a class that are created. They were in my other project as well. And we do a builder.services.add scoped. So at this point, I have everything available to me as if I had that var db equals in the other one. And this code is just repeatable. It's the same thing you use all the time. The other difference here is we're running this locally, and I'm going to use it from App Builder. So I add a policy that says, let me use a local file here. All right. So I'm not going to go into all the details on everything here because it's exactly what we did at the webinar a month ago. And if you want to learn how to set all this up, you can go and watch that webinar. But it's super simple. It's all very repeatable. The only new thing we introduced here was the use of stored procedures. And you'll see that it's exactly how you would use just table. So for example, in this web API, which you can grab off of GitHub after the webinar, I have using the entity framework, like just the table direct. And then I'm doing stuff that's actually using the stored procedure. So everything that uses stored procedure has an underscore SP. So for example, if I want to do a get and I want to do that get based on an ID, I'm just passing the parameter in as a get, and then I'm calling my stored procedure. In my stored procedures, I have output parameters. The output parameter is defined as just an output parameter in entity framework. So if we look at a stored procedure here, so let's go to SP select project, for example, and view definition. This is what it looks like. Oh, that's not a good one to get. Let's do select task because that doesn't have an output parameter. Well, isn't that great? The two that I bring up don't have output parameters. Delete project has an output parameter, I think. So anyway, an output parameter that's defined in your stored procedure, bad part of the demo, just remove that from your thought. And if you're a seasoned database developer, you know you want output parameters, you have an error parameter, and then sometimes you're actually returning an object. So a lot of my inserts, I'm saying select where I get the identity column. So in order to pass that correctly, when I do this, you can see that in my IntelliSense, I've got my ID, which it expects, the output parameters, and the cancellation token. So what I'm going to do is just hit tab, and it will auto complete this for me based on what it sees. And a lot of this is done automatically for you. At post, so this is a little, actually, I think this is the same thing we did last time. There's a few ways to add new objects. Here's a post, and here's a post. So depending on what fields are coming across in the object that you're passing, you might want to create like a DTO, a data transfer object, or just create an instance of the class that you're trying to add. And then you're pulling those items from whatever came in, and then you're applying them to the object, and then you're adding the object. This code and this code return the exact same result. They are identical. The only difference is this is showing you how to do a little bit more with, hey, maybe I want to, maybe date due should always be date time dot now, right? Or whatever you want to do. So you can customize whatever comes in through this data transfer object, and then you're just calling add async. This is all part of Entity Framework, has nothing to do with Entity Framework Power Tools. The Entity Framework Power Tools is sort of already done. In this case, an update, we're doing the same thing, data transfer object. Here is an update using the stored procedure. If you've done stored procedures, this looks awfully familiar to you. You have your stored procedure, and then you're just passing parameters. And in this case, I am getting the output parameter back. At the same time, in my inserts, I'm also doing a select on the identity column, so then I can do something with that later, and that'll give me all the fields back, all my updated fields, plus what's that new task ID that I stuck in there. So I will get that back just like I would if I did post using just straight up Entity Framework. And again, another stored procedure. This has a little bit of error handling, an error output parameter, and then this one's doing a delete. This is actually not using a stored procedure. This one is using a stored procedure. So you kind of get the idea of how this works. So all this code is very, very similar to what we did, all except adding stored procedures. So now that I did all this, let's go ahead and do a get real quick. And we'll add a couple of these guys, and we'll just kind of play around here for a second. So this said there is one, it's task name nice, and that's what I get. So now let's do a post. We can do a post using our data transfer object, and I'm just going to leave all the defaults, and I'm just going to add in my priorities. We can hit execute here, and it says, hey, you inserted this object, and its ID is number 2. So now let's do a post with our stored procedure. This will give us basically the same results. Let's do 2 and 1, and I execute, and I should get a response, okay. And it said, hey, you just inserted task ID number 3, right? So if you remember, I said there's no difference in what's happening here. There's not. The difference is that when by default, if my stored procedure wasn't expecting to return something, it wouldn't. So if we go to the insert task stored procedure, this guy here, what you're going to see is that I've got the fields that are coming in like so, insert values, and then I do a select where my task ID equals @ identity. If I'm just using straight up tables with Entity Framework, it does all that for me. I do it myself with stored procedures. Stored procedures give you another level of control in what you're doing. So now we've added task ID 3. So let's go to delete task ID. Let's try this guy out. Or no, wait, do I have a delete stored procedure here somewhere? Delete task ID SP. So let's go ahead and run this guy. We'll try it out. So this will do the stored procedure. We'll execute this. And I got a response 200. Task 3 should be missing. And that was all using the stored procedure. If I execute this, I've got task 1 and 2. Task 3 is gone. I think you get the point. Pretty cool, huh? All right. Thank you, Eric, for continuing to answer questions. So now how do we pull this in together into an application? So I've got my project manager web API, and for whatever reason here, oh yeah, it is up there on GitHub. So that'll be good. You'll get that link. And then this is the application that I told you I had already been running. So let's go ahead and look at what this app looks like. So when I code generated from App Builder, and if you haven't seen any webinars on App Builder, basically I do this. So here is my application. I've got 3 screens, right? And I'm going to go to my grid Crud. I'm going to delete this screen or delete that grid. And all I did here was I added my tasks web API. My tasks web API, I've got 2 things here, 2 gets that I got. And keep in mind, and I've said this 1,000 times in every webinar, but we're adding post, delete, and put this year. And I'm hoping by the end of November, we will be seeing that. So you won't have to write most of the code that I'm going to show you right now. But I've got my test web API. I hit Control E. I select a grid. I go to the grid. I go to test web API. I select my data source. Remember, we did Zdravko and string. We did those guys. Now I want to set some properties on this. So I want to do filtering, cell selection, column, toolbar, paging, row actions, row editing, row selection, cell editing. I just do everything, right? Because it's fun and it's amazing that you can do all this without writing a single line of code. And so it generated all the code for me. And you can see here, these are all the properties that it set on the grid. These are the fields that it generated. And then we've got this cool thing called the action strip. And the action strip is what hovers over the cells that allows you to do some of this editing stuff. So that's this guy here, the action strip. But here's my running app. I click edit. I'm back in the editor. I publish to GitHub. It goes up to GitHub. If I make a change, it'll do a pull request, all this good stuff. So I already did all that. So that's this running. And this is this code in VS Code. So here is the grid. And what I did first was I went over to my web service API. So by default, the app builder generated the code to actually get the tasks. So it generated all this code that will pull all the tasks in. And then in this page, which is the component you just saw, it's actually ng on init. It's subscribing to that data and it automatically binds it. So I didn't have to write any of that code. The only code I have to write is doing the updates and the deletes in the ads. And that's the stuff that we're working on now to auto-generate. So this code here, we will be auto-generating. Today, I wrote it. And this is the exact same code I wrote in the last webinar on creating your first web API. The only difference is I'm doing 3 different things here. My get is just getting the task. So that's getting it directly from a table. My add is using the data transfer object, the DTO web service that we used. My update is doing the task stored procedure, task SP on the HTTP put. And then the delete is doing a delete on the same thing, task SP, HTTP delete. So a combination of things. Obviously, you're going to do whatever you want in your apps, but this is just to show how it works. Now, how do we wire all this together? The grid itself allows you to add events, and then those events, you write a little bit of code in the code behind for the component. So in this case, there's 3 events I want to handle in the Angular grid. I want to handle the row added, the row deleted, and the row edit done. They're self-explanatory. You don't really need to know anything more about those events, except that I'm going to create a function for row added, row deleted, and row edited, and I'm going to pass in the event args. I also did a couple more things here. In the HTML that gets generated, and again, this is something that when we ship, we're actually doing a big web app builder update this week. This should be done automatically. Zdravko can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but I have date added, date updated, date due. The data type here, I changed to date. They came across as a string. I changed it to date in this code. And the reason I changed it to date is because when I do that, the grid automatically gives me the date time editor, which is beautiful, or the date editor, which is beautiful. So I don't have to do anything. And then here, if I go to the code behind, in order to respond to row added, row deleted, and row edited, I got the event args, in this case, row data event args on a row added, row deleted, row data event args, and row edited. I get the IG grid edit done event args. And with this guy, you have to make sure that you're not adding the row, that you're just doing an update. And here I'm calling update, or I'm sorry, here I'm calling add task, delete task, and update task. So all of this stuff, if I just type it, you've got your task API.web service. And then what am I doing? I'm going to call delete task. And then what do I need to send in my delete task? I need to send what's in my event arg. So I've got event.data. And then what's in my data? I got my task ID, like so. And then that gets sent over to my function. And then in this case, I'm doing update task, new value, event.new value. These are different event args. We got old value and new value here, I believe. So I've got new value. Do I have old value? Yeah, new value and old value. So I'm editing my field and I want to know what was there before and what was there after. So we track all this for you. And in this case, I'm just going to say pass it the new value and then update task. If we go to update task, it's going to take in the new value, which is of type task. And then I'm going to call my stored procedure and it's going to go off to the races and do what it needs to do. So that's kind of how everything ties together. All of it is the same from the webinar we did a couple of weeks ago, with the exception of changing what I'm calling. So if I hit refresh on this guy, and we'll do the same thing. Maybe I'll delete this row. I'll go ahead and add a new row here, task 2. And remember, I mentioned that you automatically get the component of like a drop-down date picker here because we called it a date field. And so in App Builder, you'll be able to say with this new update, this field is a date, this field is a number, and then these things will happen automatically for you. And then we click done and all this stuff kind of goes nicely like so. And I get my data. And you know what? I did do something wrong here. Event.data. So what I did wrong is event.data. If I go to delete task, I'm actually pulling out the task ID here. I'm passing in the entire task object. I'm not just passing in the ID. So that was a mistake I made. And I'm pulling it out here instead of doing it in the code behind. So now that compiled, and let's just go ahead and delete this guy again and hit refresh, and we won't see it anymore. So that is how you pull together all of your entity framework with EF Core Power Tools, with the SQL Server database to add all the CRUD in the world that you want, and then how you can call it from your Angular app. So the amazing thing is it's really not a lot of code. It's actually hardly any code. And EF Core Power Tools makes this so easy. The amount of code it saved me from writing to start working with my database in a real CRUD experience is just like unbelievable, which is really slick. And now I created this in a web API. You don't have to create a web API. You can create a C#, WPF app. You can create any type of app that you want. The reason that none of this shows up in the swashbuckle and the open API guy here is because I'm just calling functions and kind of getting data back. In order to have all that show up nicely, you need to be doing a map post, map put, map get. So that UI is all created automatically here in my Chrome browser. All this stuff is created automatically because I am using verbs, HP verbs, and there's functions behind all this stuff. So that's where you get this, and that's what gets pulled into App Builder as well. So the App Builder will just read in this swagger.json URL, and it'll automatically enable you to have all the stuff that you need for your application. So with that, let's wrap this up. It looks like all the questions have been answered. Thank you, everyone, for doing that. Yes, so the big thing is Blazor, Blazor, Blazor. Everyone loves Blazor. Yes, all the code gen works for Blazor. Here's the big difference, is that the grid is different. In 3 weeks, the grid in Blazor will be identical to the grid that you saw today. The grid that's currently in Blazor doesn't have all the features and it doesn't support all the theming. That's what we're shipping with 22.2. That's like huge for everyone, because we'll be shipping absolutely the best grid on the market, and it's exactly what you all need to build your Blazor apps. All right, everyone, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today, and we will see you at the next webinar.